Hey guys, Miss Litzoff here. I am going to read with you today the last chapter we'll be reading together in the book, The Immortal Life of HeLa Ch. We're going to read chapter 22 together, which starts on page 170. So if you wouldn't mind grabbing your books. Just letting you know this is the last one we'll read together, but we do still encourage you all to finish the book on your own. Tomorrow we'll be hosting a mandatory Zoom meeting at 3 p.m. so that we can watch the video together and have a little bit of a book analysis and talk about it. Again, it will be mandatory, okay? So we'll hope to see you then. So I'm starting on page 170, and again, this is chapter 22. It's called The Fame She So Richly Deserves. One afternoon in the late spring of 1970, George Guy stood in his favorite waters on the bank of the Potomac River, where he and several other Johns Hopkins researchers had been fishing together every Wednesday for years. Suddenly, Guy was so exhausted he could hardly hold his fishing rod. His buddies dragged him up the embankment to the white Jeep he'd bought using the money from a cancer research award. Soon after that fishing trip, at the age of 71, Guy learned he had a disease he'd spent his entire life trying to fight, and he had one of the most deadly forms, pancreatic cancer. If doctors didn't operate, Guy knew he would die within months. If they did, it might buy him a little time, or it might not. On August 8th, 1970, around 6 a.m., Margaret called each member of Guy's lab staff, including a postdoctoral student who'd just flown in on the red-eye from Europe. "Come down to the lab as fast as you can," she told them. "There's going to be an emergency procedure this morning." She didn't tell them what the procedure would be. Before going into the operating room, George told his surgeons that he wanted them to take samples of his tumor, just as Dr. Wharton had done with Henrietta's tumor decades earlier. Guy gave his lab staff careful instructions for growing GG, a line of cancer cells taken from his pancreas. He'd hoped that his cells, like Henrietta's, would become immortal. So if you catch that there, Henrietta Lacks was HeLa, he's George Guy, GG. "Work all day and night if you have to," he told his postdoc assistants. "Make this happen." Soon, with Guy anesthetized on the operating table, surgeons opened him up and found that the cancer was inoperable. Growths covered his stomach, spleen, liver, and intestines. They worried that cutting into the cancer might kill him. Despite Guy's wishes, they'd sewn him up without taking any samples. When he awoke from the anesthesia and found there would be no GG line, he was furious. If this cancer was going to kill him, he wanted to help advance science in the process. As soon as he'd recovered enough from his surgery to travel, Guy began contacting cancer researchers around the country, asking who was doing research on pancreatic cancer and needed a patient to experiment on. He was flooded with replies, some from scientists he didn't know, others from friends and colleagues. In the 3 months between his surgeries and his death, Guy went to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota for a week of treatments with his experimental Japanese drug that made him violently ill. His son, George Jr., who had just finished medical school, sat with Guy through the whole thing and made sure that he had a freshly pressed suit each day. After leaving the Mayo Clinic, Guy spent several days in New York City at Sloan Kettering for another study, and he underwent chemotherapy at Hopkins using a drug not yet approved for use in humans. Guy was 6.5 feet tall and about 215 pounds when he was diagnosed, but he withered quickly. He often doubled over from abdominal pain. He vomited constantly, and the treatment soon left him confined to a wheelchair. But he continued showing up at the lab and writing letters to his colleagues. At some point not long before his death, he told his former assistant, Mary Kubitschek, that it was fine to finally release Henrietta's name if anybody asked, since it had been so many years. But Mary never told a soul. George Guy died on November 8th, 1970. A few months after Guy's death, Howard Jones and several Hopkins colleagues, including Victor Makusik, a leading geneticist, decided to write an article about the history of HeLa cell line as a tribute to Guy's career. Before writing the article, Jones pulled Henrietta's medical records to remind himself of the details of her case. When he saw the photographs of her biopsy, he immediately realized her tumor had been misdiagnosed. To be sure, he dug out the original biopsy sample, which had been stored on a shelf since 1951. In December of 1971, when Jones and his colleagues published their tribute to Guy in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, they reported that the original pathologist had misinterpreted and mislabeled Henrietta's cancer. Her tumor was invasive, but not the epidermoid carcinoma as originally diagnosed, but rather the article said a very aggressive adenocarcinoma of the cervix, meaning it originated from glandular tissue inside the cervix instead of epithelial tissue, which is outside. A misdiagnosis of this type was not uncommon at the time. In 1951, the same year Jones biopsied Henrietta's tumors, researchers from Columbia University reported that the two types of cancer were easily and often confused. According to Howard Jones and other gynecologic oncologists I talk with, the correct diagnosis wouldn't have changed the way Henrietta's cancer was treated. By 1951, at least 12 studies had found that cervical adenocarcinomas and epidermoid carcinomas responded the same to radiation, which was the treatment of choice for both types. Though it wouldn't have changed Henrietta's treatment, this new diagnosis could help explain why the cancer spread throughout her body so much faster than expected. Cervical adenocarcinomas are often more aggressive than epidermoid. Her syphilis, it turns out, could have been a factor as well, as syphilis can surpass the immune system and allow cancer to spread faster than normal. Regardless, Jones and his colleagues wrote that the new diagnosis was but a footnote to the abiding genius of George Guy. It had been often said that the scientific discovery results when the right man is in the right place at the right time. And Guy, they said, was precisely that man. And HeLa was the result of that luck. If allowed to grow uninhibited under optimal cultural conditions, HeLa would take over the world by this time, they wrote. The biopsy has secured for the patient, Henrietta Lacks as HeLa, an immortality which has now reached 20 years. Will she live forever if nurtured by the hands of future workers? Even now, Henrietta Lacks, first as Henrietta and then as HeLa, has a combined age of 51 years. This was the first time Henrietta's real name appeared in print. Along with it, for the first time, ran the now ubiquitous photo of Henrietta standing with her hands on her hips. The caption called her Henrietta Lacks, HeLa. With that publication, Henrietta's doctor and his colleagues forever linked Henrietta, Lawrence, Sonny, Deborah, Zachariah, their children, and all future generations of Laxes to the HeLa cells and the DNA inside them. And Henrietta's identity would soon spread from lab to lab as quickly as her cells. Just 3 weeks after Henrietta's name was first published, Richard Nixon signed the National Cancer Act into law and launched the War on Cancer, designating $1.5 billion for cancer research over the next 3 years. In a move many believe was intended to distract the attention away from the Vietnam War, Nixon announced that scientists would cure cancer within 5 years, just in time for the United States bicentennial. With this new funding came intense political pressure for scientists to meet the president's deadline. So all of a sudden, there's all this pressure to cure cancer. Researchers raced to find what they believed to be the elusive cancer virus, with hopes of developing a vaccine to prevent it. So at this time, they think all cancer is caused by a virus, and they're going to discover this magical vaccine to cure it. Obviously, very few cancers are caused by viruses, most are not. And in May 1972, we're at the top of page 174. In May of 1972, Nixon pledged that American and Russian scientists would work together in a biomedical exchange program to find the virus. Though much of the war on cancer hinged on research using cell cultures, few people knew that those cultures had been contaminated with HeLa. A Washington Post reporter had been at the conference when Gartler announced the contamination problem, but hadn't covered it. And most scientists were still denying that the problem existed. Some were even conducting studies aimed at disproving Gartler's findings. If you recall earlier in a chapter, the HeLa bomb chapter, they talked about how HeLa cells had invaded every petri dish in the lab, the pancreas dishes that were studying pancreatic cancer, all of the different studies were all contaminated with HeLa cells that had gone airborne in the labs without their knowledge. And so pretty much, decades of research was destroyed by HeLa cells. A lot of scientists didn't still want to admit that right now, and it's all coming to a head when they're under this new pressure. But the problem wasn't going away. Near the end of 1972, when Russian scientists claimed they'd found a cancer virus in cells from Russian cancer patients, The U.S. government had samples of the cells hand-delivered to the Naval Biomedical Research Laboratory in California for testing. It turned out those cells weren't from Russian cancer patients at all. They were from Henrietta Lacks. The man who discovered that fact was Walter Nelson Reese, a chromosome expert who was director of cell culture at the Naval Laboratory. Nelson Reese had been in the audience when Gartler presented his infamous research, and he was one of the few scientists who believed it. Nelson Reese had since been hired by the National Cancer Institute to help stop the contamination problem. He would become known as the vigilante who would post the HeLa hit lists in Science magazine, listing any contaminated lines he found, along with the names of researchers who'd given him the cells. He didn't warn the researchers when he found that their cells had been contaminated with HeLa. He just published their names, the equivalent of having the scarlet H, like the scarlet letter, pasted on their lab door. Despite all the evidence, most researchers still refused to believe there was a problem, and the media didn't seem to notice until news hit that Russian cells had been contaminated by American ones. Only then did newspapers in London, Arizona, New York, and Washington run headlines saying things like, "Cancer cells from long-dead women invade other cultures." They reported serious confusion, misguided research, and millions of wasted dollars. Suddenly, for the first time since Collier's articles in the 50s, the press was very interested in the woman behind those cells. And they called her Helen Larson or Helen Lane, but never Henrietta Lacks, because Jones and McCusick had published her name in a small science journal that only few people read. Rumors spread about the identity of the mysterious Helen L. Some said she'd been Guy's secretary, or maybe his mistress. Others said she was a prostitute off the streets near Hopkins, or a figment of Guy's imagination, a fictitious character he'd created to hide the true identity of the woman behind the cells. As Helen showed up in articles again and again with different last names, a few scientists began feeling the need to set the record straight. On March 9, 1973, the journal Nature published a letter from J. Douglas, a biologist at Brunel University. Here's the letter. "It is 21 years since George Guy established the famous HeLa cells in culture. It has been estimated that the weight of those cells in the world today exceeds that of the American Negro from whose cervical tumor they originated. That lady has achieved true immortality, both in the test tube and in the hearts and minds of scientists in the world over, since the value of HeLa cells in research, diagnosis, etc. is inestimable. Yet we do not know her name. It has been widely stated that he and La are the first letters of her name, but whereas one textbook says the names were Helen Lane, another says Henrietta Lacks. My letters to the author, inquiring the source of their information, like the letter to the hospital from which Guy's paper emanated, remain unanswered. Does anyone know for sure? Would it be contrary to medical ethics in the HeLa's cells coming of age year to authenticate the name and let the he and the la enjoy the fame she so richly deserves?" Douglas was flooded with responses. There's no record of readers addressing his questions about medical ethics, but they did correct his grammar and his use of the word Negro in place of negress. Many replies offered the names of women they believed were behind the HeLa cells: Helga Larson, Heather Langtree, even the actress Hedy Lamarr. In a follow-up letter on April 20th, 1973, Douglas announced that all those women should withdraw as gracefully as they can, because he'd received a letter from the Howard W. Jones that left no doubt that the HeLa cells were named after Henrietta Lacks. And Jones wasn't the only one setting the record straight about Henrietta's name. Soon, Victor McCusick, one of Jones's co-authors, would send a similar letter to a reporter from Science, correcting her misuse of the name Helen Lane. In response, the journalist wrote a short follow-up in the article in Science entitled HeLa for Henrietta Lacks. In it, she explained that she'd inadvertently repeated the lore about the origin of those cells. Then, in one of the most widely read science journals in the world, she corrected her error. Helen Lane, it seems, never lived, but Henrietta Lacks did, long protected by the pseudonym Helen Lane. She also reported that Henrietta's tumor had been incorrectly diagnosed. None of this alters the validity of the work done with HeLa cells, she wrote, but it may be worth noting for the record. I'd say so. And with that, I sign off. Thanks, guys, for listening, and have a great day.